This is the first of several mini lectures on Paul and his letters. This lecture considers the differences and similarities between how Paul is portrayed in the book of Acts and how Paul presents himself in his letters. The place to begin is just to distinguish the nature of evidence, right? So, first-hand evidence. We have Paul writing from his own hand or perhaps through someone else, but it's coming from Paul. In Acts, it's second-hand evidence. It's Luke's use of sources or Luke's own sort of literary and theological crafting of Paul and his speeches. In addition to being first-hand versus second-hand knowledge, we might say that there are limits and biases in both sorts of evidence. So Paul, because he writes occasional letters, doesn't tell us everything that he believes. And we know at least of one letter to the Corinthians that we no longer have present. There is no extant copy of this letter, although he mentions it. And likewise, Paul is biased in his writing. He is writing from a particular perspective. He's writing often to persuade communities of faith to live or do or respond in a particular way. And as we've explored in the previous section of this class, Luke also has his theological motivations for telling the story of the early church, including Paul, in a particular way. So there are some broad similarities between how Paul appears in his letters and how he appears in Acts. The first is that Paul is certainly a Jew in both of these sources and appears to maintain some sort of continued practice or adherence to Judaism. And so while it is important to note that Paul may not invite the Gentiles to continue in Jewish practices, there is little evidence to suggest that he himself stopped his participation in those practices. The second similarity is that Paul had some sort of transforming experience with the risen Lord that sort of propelled him into his mission and into his ministry. Related to that is that both the letters and Acts provide sort of a clear insight that Paul understood his mission primarily to Gentiles. His goal was to take the gospel to the uncircumcised, not those of the circumcised, of Israel. Even with these similarities, though, there are some important differences. The first concerns the nature of conflict. So when you read the letters of Paul, you'll see that Paul is mostly in conflict with his communities, or perhaps with outsiders coming into his communities and sort of stirring things up. But when you come to Acts, you'll see that Paul is often in conflict with authorities, whether Jewish or Roman authorities. And so the nature of conflict is pretty different, right? I mean, Paul doesn't talk so much about being brought before Roman officials. He does in 2 Corinthians note his experience of being imprisoned and suffering and so forth, but he doesn't say that this was officially carried out by a Roman authority. It's more likely that it was a local response, possibly sort of a disciplinary arm of the synagogue that Paul encountered. There are also important differences in the overall chronology of Paul's life. So the missionary journeys that appear in Acts, it's hard to sort of nail down with certainty how those correspond to the letters that Paul has written. And some of the letters and missionary journeys don't even seem to add up, right? So we have different journeys or different letters to different locations. Another thing is the place of the Jerusalem Council in Paul's ministry. How many years after his initial encounter with Christ did that take place? And then finally, the collection for Jerusalem seems to be, something that Paul is really concerned about in his letters, but it's not such a significant thing in Acts, or at least it doesn't fall in the same sort of line. There are different versions of the apostolic council. That is a phrase that describes the sort of decision that the church makes in Acts 15 to accept Gentiles without making them become Jewish first, without enforcing circumcision. And so if you compare how Paul tells the story in Galatians 2, 1 through 10, with how the story appears in Acts 15, you'll notice some significant differences. Most importantly, Acts 15 suggests that, everybody sort of got along, and it was sort of a very ironic process. Galatians 2 makes it sound like it was a bit more rocky, and that rockiness continued when Peter visits Paul in Antioch and refuses to share a meal with the uncircumcised believers. And then finally, the place of Jerusalem is really significant. Remember that in Acts in general, and in Luke Acts in general, Jerusalem is a major place. It's important. It comes up again and again. But in Paul's letters, we don't have that sense that Paul was going back and forth to Jerusalem. There isn't that emphasis. We, I think, have a detection of a trip to Jerusalem, maybe in Romans 16. He mentions in the letters to the Thessalonians that the believers in Judea were persecuted, but it doesn't sort of have the center of gravity that it does in the book of Acts. This brief lecture has given you an overview of some of the complexities of thinking about the relationship between Paul as he is presented in Acts and Paul as he appears in his letters. Thank you for your attention.